What advice would you give to a young person today about life, about career? We talked about startups. We talked about music. We talked about the end of human civilization. Is there advice you would give to a young person today, maybe in college, maybe in high school, about their life?
Well, let's see. I mean, there's so many domains you can advise on, and you know, I'm not going to give advice on life because I fear that I would drift into sort of hallmark bromides that really wouldn't be all that distinctive, and they might be entirely true. Sometimes the greatest insights about life turn out to be like the kinds of things you'd see on a Hallmark card. So I'm going to steer clear of that. On a career level, one thing that I think is unintuitive but unbelievably powerful is to focus not necessarily on being in the top sliver of 1% in excelling at one domain that's important and valuable, but to think in terms of intersections of two domains, which are rare but valuable. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is in an incredibly competitive world that is so much more competitive than it was when I was coming out of school, radically more competitive than when I was coming out of school. To navigate your way to the absolute pinnacle of any domain. Let's say you want to be, really, really great at, Python, pick a language, whatever it is. You want to be one of the world's greatest Python developers, JavaScript, whatever your language is. Hopefully it's not Cobalt. But
by the way, if you listen to this, I am actually looking for a Cobalt expert to interview because I find language fascinating, and there's not many of them. So please, if you know a world expert in Cobalt or Fortran, but both actually, please,
or if you are one,
please email me.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're going out there and you want to be in the top sliver 1% of Python developers, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly if you want to be number one in the world, something like that. And I'll use an analogy. Is I had a friend in college who was on a track and indeed succeeded at that to become an Olympic medalist in, I think it was 100-meter breaststroke. And he mortgaged a significant percentage of his sort of college life to that goal, or I should say dedicated or invested or whatever you wanted to say. But he didn't participate in a lot of the social, a lot of the late night, a lot of the this, a lot of the that, because he was training so much. And obviously he also wanted to keep up with his academics. And at the end of the day, story has a happy ending in that he did medal in that. Bronze, not gold, but holy cow, anybody who gets an Olympic medal, that's an extraordinary thing. And at that moment, he was, one of the top 3 people on earth at that thing. But wow, how hard to do that. How many thousands of other people went down that path and made similar sacrifices and didn't get there. It's very, very hard to do that. Whereas, I'll use a personal example. When I came out of business school, I went to a good business school and learned the things that were there to be learned. And I came out and I entered a world with lots of MBAs.
Harvard Business School, by the way.
Okay, yes, it was Harvard. It's true.
You're the first person who went there who didn't say where you went, which is beautiful. I appreciate that. It's one of the greatest business schools in the world. It's a whole nother fascinating conversation about that world. But anyway, yes.
But anyway, so I learned the things that you learn getting an MBA from a top program, and I entered a world that had hundreds of thousands of people who had MBAs, probably hundreds of thousands who had them from top 10 programs. But so I was not particularly great at being an MBA person. I was inexperienced relative to most of them, and there were a lot of them. But it was okay MBA person, right? Newly minted. But then, as it happened, I found my way into working on the commercial internet in 1994. So I went to at the time, giant and hot computing company called Silicon Graphics, which had enough heft and enough, headcount that they could take on inexperienced MBAs and try to train them in the world of Silicon Valley. But within that company that had an enormous amount of surface area and was touching a lot of areas and had unbelievably smart people at the time, it was not surprising that SGI started doing really interesting and innovative and trailblazing stuff on the internet before almost anybody else. And part of the reason was that our founder, Jim Clark, went off to co-found Netscape with Mark Andreessen. So the whole company was like, wait, what was that? What's this commercial internet thing? So I end up in that group. Now, in terms of being a commercial internet person or a World Wide Web person, Again, I was in that case barely credentialed. I couldn't write a stitch of code, but I had a pretty good mind for grasping the business and cultural significance of this transition. And this was, again, we were talking earlier about emerging areas. Within a few months, I was in the relatively top echelon of people in terms of just sheer experience. Because let's say it was 5 months into the program, there were only so many people who'd been doing World Wide Web stuff commercially for 5 months, And then what was interesting, though, was the intersection of those two things. The commercial web, as it turned out, grew into an unbelievable vastness. And so by being a pretty good, okay web person and a pretty good, okay MBA person, that intersection put me in a very rare group, which was web-oriented MBAs. And in those early days, you could probably count on your fingers the number of people who came out of really competitive programs who were doing stuff full-time on the internet. And there was a greater appetite for great software developers in the internet domain, but there was an appetite, and a real one, and a rapidly growing one, for MBA thinkers who were also seasoned and networked in the emerging world of the commercial World Wide Web. And so finding an intersection of two things you can be pretty good at, but is a rare intersection and a special intersection, is probably a much easier way to make yourself distinguishable and in demand from the world than trying to be world-class at this one thing.
So in the intersection is where there's to be discovered opportunity and success. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
There's actually more intersection of fields than fields themselves, right? So
yeah, I'll give you kind of a funny hypothetical here, but it's one I've been thinking about a little bit. There's a lot of people in crypto right now. It'd be hard to be in the top percentile of crypto people, whether it comes from just having a sheer grasp of the industry, a great network within the industry, technological skills, whatever you want to call it. And then there's this parallel world, an orthogonal world called crop insurance. And there's, I'm sure that's a big world. Crop insurance is a very, very big deal, particularly in the wealthy and industrialized world where there's sophisticated financial markets, rule of law, and, large agricultural concerns that are worried about that. Somewhere out there is somebody who is pretty crypto savvy, but probably not top 1%, but also has kind of been in the crop insurance world and understands that a hell of a lot better than almost anybody who's ever had anything to do with cryptocurrency. And so I think that decentralized finance, DeFi, one of the interesting and I think very world positive things that I think it's almost inevitably will be bringing to the world is crop insurance for small holding farmers. People who have tiny, tiny plots of land in places like India, et cetera, where there is no crop insurance available to them because just the financial infrastructure doesn't exist. But it's highly imaginable that using Oracle networks that are trusted outside deliverers of factual information about rainfall in a particular area, you can start giving drought insurance to folks like this. The right person to come up with that idea is not a crypto whiz who doesn't know a blasted thing about smallholding farmers. The right person to come up with that is not a crop insurance whiz who isn't quite sure what Bitcoin is, but somebody occupies that intersection. That's just one of gazillion examples of things that are going to come along for somebody who occupies the right intersection of skills, but isn't necessarily the number one person at either one of those expertises.
That's making me kind of wonder about my own little things that I'm average at and seeing where the intersections that could be exploited. That's pretty profound.